Imagine a person who wants a different life, but keeps returning to the same room, the same phone, the same evening drift. Clear begins with a brutal personal story. A baseball bat hits him in the face during high school, and recovery becomes slow, humiliating, and practical. That opening matters because the book is not selling a dramatic personality transplant. It studies how a person rebuilds through tiny actions repeated long after the heroic feeling is gone. For the viewer, the first move is to stop asking for a new mood and start asking what action can become small enough to survive an ordinary day. Imagine a reader after a painful setback. Try to become disciplined again. You might expect the answer to be one huge decision, but the actual result is slower. Identity returns through repeated evidence. A habit is a vote for the person you are becoming. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition, but demanding about design. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. The mechanism is deliberately ordinary. The cue must be seen. The craving must feel worth following. The response must be within reach, and the reward must teach the brain that the action should be repeated. A useful test is to ask where the behavior begins before the behavior begins. The night before, the open tab, the visible object, the group expectation, or the first 2 minutes. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to opening, the invisible vote, and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What actually changes a life when motivation disappears? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The surprising part of improvement is that the work and the reward rarely arrive on the same day. Clear frames tiny gains through compounding. Getting 1% better is easy to dismiss, but repeated gains can become much larger than the initial action suggested. The plateau of latent potential protects the truth that progress can be accumulating while visible results still look flat. This is why people quit just before evidence arrives. Measure the system before judging the outcome. If the cue, action, and reward are stable, the boring period may be storage, not failure. Picture a person learning, exercising, or saving money for 3 quiet weeks. What do you expect they will see? The actual result may look unchanged, yet the hidden curve is already bending. The breakthrough is usually delayed evidence, not sudden magic. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive, but the identity proof is weak. The deeper point is that behavior is not floating in empty space. It is attached to objects, rooms, people, labels, convenience, and the emotional story a person tells after acting. Another useful test is to ask what reward the current routine is protecting, because removing the routine without replacing the reward often leaves the craving alive. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to the plateau of latent potential and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Why do tiny improvements feel useless until they suddenly matter? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Goals describe the result you want. Systems describe the life that keeps producing results after the excitement fades. The book argues that winners and losers can share the same goals. The difference is not the wish. It is the daily process that makes the wish repeatable. A goal can create direction, but a system creates returns. The goal says lose weight, write a book, study more, or be calmer. The system asks what happens at breakfast, what happens at the desk, what happens when stress arrives. Keep the goal as a compass, then audit the system as if it were a machine. Cues, locations, friction, rewards, and identity evidence. Suppose two students both predict top marks. Which would you trust more, the louder promise or the quieter study environment? The reveal is that the environment usually tells the truth first. You do not rise to goals, you fall to systems. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. This is why the same person can look inconsistent across different settings. A better setting can reveal capacity that a worse setting kept interrupting. The viewer can audit the design by writing one line for cue, craving, response, and reward, then changing the weakest link instead of blaming the whole personality. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to goals versus systems and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Why can two people have the same goal but different futures? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The deepest layer of a habit is not the behavior itself. It is the self-image the behavior proves. Clear separates outcome change, process change, and identity change. The fragile version says, I want to run a marathon. The stronger version says, I am becoming a runner, one run at a time. Identity-based habits work because every action is evidence. A single action is not destiny, but every repetition casts a small vote. Missed days do not erase the election. They simply stop adding evidence for a moment. Choose the identity in plain language, then choose the smallest proof. If the identity is reader, read one page. If the identity is calm parent, pause before one response. Imagine someone who says, I am terrible with discipline. Would you expect a planner to fix that belief? The actual result changes when tiny proofs make the old identity harder to believe. Identity is built by evidence, not by slogans. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition, but demanding about design. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive, but the identity proof is weak. The source keeps returning to this practical pattern because the habit is never only one action. It is the whole chain that makes the action feel natural enough to repeat. The practical standard is not perfection. The standard is whether the next repetition becomes slightly easier to begin and slightly more satisfying to finish. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to identity-based habits and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What if behavior change starts with the question, who am I becoming? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Habits are not random. They're loops that the brain keeps because they solve a recurring problem. Clear uses the sequence cue, craving, response, and reward. The cue notices a possibility, the craving gives it desire, the response performs it, and the reward teaches the brain to repeat it. This loop becomes the foundation for the 4 laws. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. For bad habits, Invert the laws until the cue is hidden, the desire is dull, the action is difficult, and the payoff is unrewarding. When a habit fails, diagnose the loop instead of blaming the person. Is the cue visible? Is the behavior attractive? Is the first action easy? Is the reward immediate enough? Consider a phone on the table during work. What happens next if the screen lights up? You might expect willpower to decide, but the reveal is that the cue has already started the loop. A broken habit is usually a broken loop. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. The mechanism is deliberately ordinary. The cue must be seen. The craving must feel worth following. The response must be within reach, and the reward must teach the brain that the action should be repeated. A useful test is to ask where the behavior begins before the behavior begins. The night before, the open tab, the visible object, the group expectation, or the first 2 minutes. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to the habit loop and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. How does a behavior become automatic before we notice it? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The first law is not make it inspiring. It is make it obvious. Implementation, intentions, and habit stacking turn vague hope into a visible plan. Instead of I will meditate more, the plan becomes after I pour my morning coffee, I will meditate for 1 minute. The key is specificity. Time and location reduce negotiation. A current habit becomes the anchor for a new habit, so the existing rhythm carries the new action forward. Write the formula. After current habit, I will new habit. Then place the cue in the path you already travel. The goal is not to remember harder. It is to need less remembering. Imagine a reader comparing 2 stretching plans where one plan says later and one plan says after brushing teeth on the bedroom floor. What would you expect to happen? The actual result follows the clearer cue. Clarity is a form of discipline. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive but the identity proof is weak. The deeper point is that behavior is not floating in empty space. It is attached to objects, rooms, people, labels, convenience, and the emotional story a person tells after acting. Another useful test is to ask what reward the current routine is protecting, because removing the routine without replacing the reward often leaves the craving alive. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive, while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to make it obvious and keeps the source movement intact, rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What changes when the cue becomes impossible to miss? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The people who seem most disciplined are often the people who spend less time being tempted. Clear argues that environment design can outperform heroic self-control. If the cookie stays visible, the cue keeps speaking. If the guitar is on a stand, practice becomes easier to start. Context becomes a silent script. Repeated actions attach to rooms, objects, and times until the environment starts telling the body what comes next. Make the good habit visible and the bad habit invisible. Put books on the pillow, fruit on the counter, apps off the home screen, and distractions in another room. Picture a worker Who keeps a distracting app one tap away? Would you expect focus to win every afternoon? In fact, the visible cue keeps asking the same question until the worker answers badly. Self-control is easier when the room is on your side. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition, but demanding about design. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. This is why the same person can look inconsistent across different settings. A better setting can reveal capacity that a worse setting kept interrupting. The viewer can audit the design by writing one line for cue, craving, response, and reward, then changing the weakest link instead of blaming the whole personality. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to environment beats self-control and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Why is self-control often a design problem? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The second law begins with craving, because wanting often moves before thinking. Temptation bundling links a habit you need with something you already want. The book also explains that culture, family, friends, and tribes make behaviors attractive by making them feel normal or admired. Dopamine is tied not only to pleasure, but to anticipation. If the brain predicts a reward, the behavior starts gaining energy before the reward arrives. Pair a necessary action with a desirable one. Join a group where the desired behavior is normal. Reframe a difficult habit from I have to until I get to when the reframe is honest. Suppose a beginner joins a group where everyone reads, trains, or saves money. What would you expect to happen? The reveal is that belonging makes the behavior more attractive than discipline alone. Desire grows around the rewards a culture celebrates. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive, but the identity proof is weak. The source keeps returning to this practical pattern because the habit is never only one action. It is the whole chain that makes the action feel natural enough to repeat. The practical standard is not perfection. The standard is whether the next repetition becomes slightly easier to begin and slightly more satisfying to finish. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive, while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to make it attractive and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. How does desire pull behavior before logic catches up? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Humans imitate the close, the many, and the powerful. Clear shows that behavior is social. We copy people near us, habits common in the group, and behaviors attached to status. This is useful when the group honors what we want to become and dangerous when the group rewards what we're trying to leave. The social environment supplies invisible incentives. A habit becomes easier when it earns belonging and harder when it threatens belonging. Find or create a tribe where the desired habit is the normal cost of entry. Do not rely only on private ambition when a public identity can support the new behavior. Imagine someone trying to quit a bad habit while every friend treats that habit as the price of friendship. Do you think private resolve is enough? The actual pressure comes from belonging. Belonging can carry a habit farther than willpower. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. The mechanism is deliberately ordinary. The cue must be seen, the craving must feel worth following, the response must be within reach, and the reward must teach the brain that the action should be repeated. A useful test is to ask where the behavior begins before the behavior begins. The night before, the open tab, the visible object, the group expectation, or the first 2 minutes. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to family, friends, and social proof, and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Whose approval is quietly shaping the habit? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Bad habits often look irrational only when we ignore the problem they are solving. Clear encourages looking beneath the behavior. Smoking, scrolling, snacking, or procrastinating may be poor strategies, but they often answer real cravings for relief, stimulation, control, or social connection. The inversion of the second law is make it unattractive. That does not mean shame the person. It means expose the true cost and replace the false promise with a better story. Name the craving honestly. Then design a substitute response that addresses the same need with less damage. Walk, call someone, prepare the workspace, breathe, or make the next task tiny. Imagine a reader reaching for the phone whenever work feels unclear. What would you expect if they only delete the app? The actual result may fail because the underlying craving for escape remains unsolved. A bad habit is a costly answer to a real craving. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition but demanding about design. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive but the identity proof is weak. The deeper point is that behavior is not floating in empty space. It is attached to objects, rooms, people, labels, convenience, and the emotional story a person tells after acting. Another useful test is to ask what reward the current routine is protecting, because removing the routine without replacing the reward often leaves the craving alive. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to fix the causes of bad habits and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What craving is the bad habit really trying to solve? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The third law respects a simple truth. Humans drift toward the path of least effort. Clear does not ask the reader to become tougher first. He asks the reader to reduce friction for good habits and increase friction for bad habits. Repetition matters more than perfect planning. A habit becomes automatic after enough reps in a stable context. So the first goal is to make showing up easy enough to repeat. Prepare the environment in advance. Put workout clothes ready, open the document before stopping work, cut vegetables earlier, or charge the phone outside the bedroom. Suppose a guitar is inside a case in a closet while the television remote is on the couch. Which behavior would you predict wins tonight? The actual result usually follows the easier path. Friction is invisible until it decides your day. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. This is why the same person can look inconsistent across different settings. A better setting can reveal capacity that a worse setting kept interrupting. The viewer can audit the design by writing one line for cue, craving, response, and reward, then changing the weakest link instead of blaming the whole personality. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to make it easy and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Why does friction decide more behavior than intention? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The 2-minute rule turns a habit into an entrance rather than a demand. Read before bed becomes read 1 page. Run 3 miles becomes put on running shoes. The point is not that 1 page is enough forever. The point is that the ritual becomes easy to begin. A starter habit is a gateway. It standardizes the beginning, so the larger behavior has a place to grow without requiring a daily negotiation with mood. Scale the action down until it feels almost too easy. Then master the art of showing up. Once the entrance is automatic, expand carefully. Imagine someone who cannot maintain a workout plan. Would you expect a harder plan to rescue them? The reveal is that a 2-minute entrance may build more consistency than a perfect program. Standardize the beginning before you optimize the whole performance. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive, but the identity proof is weak. The source keeps returning to this practical pattern because the habit is never only one action. It is the whole chain that makes the action feel natural enough to repeat. The practical standard is not perfection. The standard is whether the next repetition becomes slightly easier to begin and slightly more satisfying to finish. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to the 2-minute rule and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. How can a tiny start protect a large habit? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Some choices are powerful because they remove future choices. Clear discusses commitment devices and one-time actions. Automate savings, buy a better mattress, remove the television, schedule a recurring class, or make a bad habit more difficult in advance. A commitment device changes the default. Instead of asking the future self to be strong every day, the present self redesigns the option set. Look for actions that keep paying after you do them once. The best habit design often happens before the tempting moment arrives. Picture someone trying to save money with a card ready for impulse purchases. What would you expect if automatic transfers happen on payday? The actual result changes because the default acts first. Design the default before desire enters the room. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition, but demanding about design. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. The mechanism is deliberately ordinary. The cue must be seen. The craving must feel worth following. The response must be within reach, and the reward must teach the brain that the action should be repeated. A useful test is to ask where the behavior begins before the behavior begins. The night before the open tab, the visible object, the group expectation, or the first 2 minutes. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to commitment devices and one-time choices and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What can be decided once so the future does not debate it daily? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The fourth law faces the mismatch between immediate rewards and delayed results. Good habits often carry delayed rewards, while bad habits often offer immediate rewards. The brain repeats what is satisfying now, even when the future cost is obvious. A habit needs an immediate signal that says this was worth doing. The reward does not have to be unhealthy. It can be visual progress, a completed tracker, a clean workspace, or a small celebration. Attach a short-term, satisfying finish to a long-term good habit. Make the reward aligned with the identity, not a reward that cancels the behavior. Suppose two savings plans are identical, but one gives a visible progress mark every week. Which would you expect to last? The reveal is that satisfaction keeps the delayed reward emotionally alive. What is immediately rewarded is usually repeated. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive but the identity proof is weak. The deeper point is that behavior is not floating in empty space. It is attached to objects, rooms, people, labels, convenience, and the emotional story a person tells after acting. Another useful test is to ask what reward the current routine is protecting, because removing the routine without replacing the reward often leaves the craving alive. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to make it satisfying and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Why does the brain repeat what feels rewarding now? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Tracking works because it makes progress visible, but it becomes dangerous if the streak turns into a fragile idol. Clear advises tracking habits and protecting the rule never miss twice. The first miss is an accident, a crisis, or a tired day. The second miss is the beginning of a new pattern. The tracker is feedback, not identity judgment. It keeps the habit satisfying and obvious, but the deeper purpose is returning quickly. When you miss, shrink the next action. Do not make the comeback dramatic. Make it immediate enough that the old identity cannot regain momentum. Imagine someone misses one workout after weeks of consistency. What happens next if they call themselves a failure? The actual danger is not the miss. It is the story that follows. The recovery is more important than the streak. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. This is why the same person can look inconsistent across different settings. A better setting can reveal capacity that a worse setting kept interrupting. The viewer can audit the design by writing one line for cue, craving, response, and reward, then changing the weakest link instead of blaming the whole personality. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to tracking and never missing twice, and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. How do you recover when the streak breaks? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Private intentions become stronger when there is a social cost for abandoning them. The book describes accountability partners and habit contracts. When someone else can see the behavior, the reward and penalty structure changes. Accountability works because humans care about reputation. The habit is no longer only about future benefit. It becomes part of present identity in front of another person. Choose accountability that is concrete, fair, and specific. Make the witness someone who supports the identity rather than someone who turns failure into humiliation. Picture a person who quietly plans to write every morning versus one who sends a daily proof to a partner. Which would you predict survives a lazy week? The actual witness changes the cost of drift. A witness can make the future feel closer. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition but demanding about design. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive but the identity proof is weak. The source keeps returning to this practical pattern because the habit is never only one action. It is the whole chain that makes the action feel natural enough to repeat. The practical standard is not perfection. The standard is whether the next repetition becomes slightly easier to begin and slightly more satisfying to finish. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to accountability and habit contracts and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What changes when behavior has a witness? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Advanced improvement is not pretending everyone is equally suited for every game. Clear argues that genes do not eliminate work, but they influence which work gives a person better returns. The point is not fatalism, it is strategy. When habits align with natural strengths, progress becomes more satisfying and competition becomes more realistic. The best game is one where effort and temperament reinforce each other. Explore enough to notice where practice feels naturally engaging, where feedback improves performance, and where your traits become assets rather than constant liabilities. Imagine two people forcing the same path because it looks prestigious. Would you expect equal progress? The reveal is that the right arena can turn discipline into momentum. Choose the game where effort compounds with fit. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. The mechanism is deliberately ordinary. The cue must be seen. The craving must feel worth following. The response must be within reach, and the reward must teach the brain that the action should be repeated. A useful test is to ask where the behavior begins before the behavior begins. The night before, the open tab, the visible object, the group expectation, or the first 2 minutes. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to genes, talent, and choosing the right game and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. Where does self-improvement become wiser by respecting fit? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. Motivation thrives near the edge of ability, where the task is neither boring nor crushing. The Goldilocks rule says people stay engaged when a challenge is just manageable. Too easy produces boredom. Too hard produces despair. The right difficulty produces attention. Mastery requires repetition, but repetition creates boredom. Professionals keep showing up after the mood fades because the work is connected to a manageable challenge and a deeper identity. Adjust the difficulty, not only the ambition. If the task is too easy, add a metric. If it is too hard, shrink the next step. Suppose a learner faces a task that is impossible today. Do you think motivation will grow from pressure alone? In fact, motivation usually returns when the challenge becomes just reachable. Motivation lives at the edge of manageable difficulty. That is why the idea feels simple on the surface and severe when applied honestly. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive but the identity proof is weak. The deeper point is that behavior is not floating in empty space. It is attached to objects, rooms, people, labels, convenience, and the emotional story a person tells after acting. Another useful test is to ask what reward the current routine is protecting, because removing the routine without replacing the reward often leaves the craving alive. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to the Goldilocks rule and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. How does motivation survive after novelty fades? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The downside of habits is that automatic behavior can become mindless behavior. Clear closes the advanced section by warning that mastery needs review. Once a habit works, the brain may stop paying attention, and small errors can become permanent. Annual reviews, integrity reports, and reflection help a person keep the benefits of automation without losing awareness. Identity must stay flexible enough to grow. Schedule reviews that ask what is working, what is slipping, and which identity has become too narrow. A useful habit should serve the person, not trap the person. Imagine an expert who never reviews the process because it once worked. What would you expect over time? The actual risk is that yesterday's strength quietly becomes today's blind spot. Automation needs reflection or it becomes a rut. Notice the contrast. The book is calm about ambition but demanding about design. The caution is important. This is not a promise that every outcome is controllable, and it is not a reason to blame people for difficult circumstances. This is why the same person can look inconsistent across different settings. A better setting can reveal capacity that a worse setting kept interrupting. The viewer can audit the design by writing one line for cue, craving, response, and reward, then changing the weakest link instead of blaming the whole personality. That is also why Clear's framework is more mechanical than inspirational. It tries to make the desired behavior obvious before enthusiasm is needed. In the full book structure, this connects to reflection, review, and the danger of mastery, and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. When can a good habit become a new limitation? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea. The final meaning of atomic habits is not that tiny habits are cute. It is that tiny habits are the practical architecture of identity. The conclusion returns to the compound logic of change. No single action transforms everything, but repeated actions change the evidence a person has about who they are. The 4 laws are a design language for ordinary life. Make the cue visible. Make the action desirable. Make the response easy. Make the reward satisfying, and keep returning when the pattern breaks. Start with one identity, one tiny proof, one redesigned cue, and one immediate reward. Then protect the loop long enough for time to do its work. Picture the viewer tomorrow morning, facing the same room and the same old cues. What would you expect if one cue is redesigned before the day begins? The actual result is small, but it is the first vote in a different election. Small habits do not add up. They compound into identity. The practical pressure point is not personality. It is the next repeatable condition. The risk is turning the tactic into performance theater, where the tracker looks impressive, but the identity proof is weak. The source keeps returning to this practical pattern because the habit is never only one action. It is the whole chain that makes the action feel natural enough to repeat. The practical standard is not perfection. The standard is whether the next repetition becomes slightly easier to begin and slightly more satisfying to finish. That is also why the book keeps separating motion from action. Planning can feel productive while the smallest real repetition is the thing that changes evidence. In the full book structure, this connects to closing, the secret to results that last, and keeps the source movement intact rather than turning the book into a list of motivational tips. For a real viewer, the question is concrete. What remains after every tactic is stripped away? The answer has to appear in the calendar, the room, the social circle, and the reward signal, or it remains only a pleasant idea.